In the spring of 1855, two sisters walked into the Oregon woods and never returned. Their disappearance became one of the most unsettling mysteries in pioneer history, whispered about in frontier towns, recorded in church logs, and even blamed on the forest itself. More than 160 years later, no one knows what happened to the Sinclair sisters, but the clues they left behind suggest something far darker than a simple case of getting lost. Welcome to Behind the Genius, where we unearth the darkest stories history tried to bury. Tonight, we travel back to the Oregon frontier of 1855, a land of towering pines, endless mist, and whispered superstitions. It's here that two young sisters vanished. No ransom, no witnesses, and no trace that made sense. Some called it a tragedy. Others swore it was something far worse. If chilling, forgotten mysteries keep you awake at night, make sure you subscribe and join us as we follow the last known footsteps of the Sinclair sisters. And before we begin, tell me, which country are you watching this video from? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to see where all our viewers are tuning in from. The year was 1855, and the small Oregon settlement of Wren's Hollow sat cradled between heavy forests and the slow-moving Willamette River. Life here had a strange rhythm, quiet, steady, but with an undercurrent that made outsiders uneasy. The people worked the land, prayed in the tiny wooden church on Sundays, and went to bed before the oil lamps could burn too low. They never said it out loud, but there was an unspoken understanding. After nightfall, no one lingered outside. The Sinclair family lived on the farthest edge of town, where the woods grew thicker and the air felt colder, even in summer. Thomas Sinclair was a farmer. His wife, Margaret, was a soft-spoken woman who always seemed to be watching something far away, as though her mind was somewhere else entirely. And then there were the sisters, Eleanor, 14, and Clara, 12. Two girls who seemed to be made from a different cloth than everyone else in Wren's Hollow. Eleanor was thoughtful, often staring too long at the dark line of the forest, as if she were listening for something. Clara was quieter still, her hands always busy with some small object, a carved doll, a string of beads, a feather she'd found on the trail. They rarely played with the other children in town. The other children didn't mind. They said the Sinclair girls whispered to each other in a way that made you feel like they were speaking about you, even if they weren't. In the last days before they vanished, the weather had turned strange. The air held a heavy stillness that made the dogs restless. The crows, which usually roost near the church, had gathered in the trees by the Sinclair house instead, watching silently from the branches. At night, the wind carried faint sounds, not quite words, but close enough to make the hair on your arms rise. On the night of August 12th, the moon was a pale slice behind thin clouds, and the Sinclair home glowed faintly from the oil lamp inside. The family had eaten dinner in silence. Margaret's eyes kept drifting to the window. Thomas sat hunched over his cup of coffee, his brow tight. Neither spoke about what had happened the day before, the strange footprints found in the dirt by the well. They were small, almost the size of a child's, but the distance between them was too wide for any normal step. That night, after the lamps were blown out, Eleanor and Clara lay in their small attic room. The air smelled faintly of pine and something else, damp earth, maybe, or old leaves. The girls whispered softly, the sound almost drowned by the creaking of the wood above their heads. Eleanor's voice was steady, but Clara's was thin, uncertain. She kept glancing toward the window, where a faint tapping could be heard now and then, like a fingertip brushing the glass. In Wren's Hollow, people said the woods were older than the town, older than anything they could imagine. Some said there were places in the forest where the ground was wrong, too soft, or too hard, or too quiet. And if you stood there too long, you might hear something breathing beneath your feet. The Sinclair girls had been told not to wander past the split oak tree on the path. But 2 days before, they had. And when they returned, they didn't speak of what they saw. They only stayed close to each other, their eyes sharper, their laughter gone. By the second night after their visit to the forest, Eleanor had stopped sleeping. She would lie still, eyes open, as though waiting for something. Clara, unable to keep her eyes closed, began to dream strange dreams, dreams where the trees swayed without wind, and something moved between the trunks, not walking but gliding, its shape never clear. On the third night, the dreams followed her into waking. That evening, as the oil lamp burned low in the Sinclair home, the sound of the tapping at the attic window grew more deliberate. Margaret noticed at first a rhythm, 3 slow taps, a pause, then 2. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was a branch in the wind. But there was no wind. Upstairs, Clara sat up in bed. Eleanor was already awake, watching her. "It's time," Eleanor whispered. "For what?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. Eleanor didn't answer. She slipped from the bed, crossed the floor, and pressed her palm to the window pane. The glass was cold, colder than it should have been for summer. On the other side of the glass, the dark was deeper than it should have been. Something moved in it. The next morning, the Sinclair house was silent. The beds were empty. Thomas and Margaret searched the attic, then the woods, then the river. No footprints, no torn fabric, no signs of struggle. The crows were gone. By the time the sun set that day, word had spread through Wren's Hollow. The Sinclair sisters had vanished without a trace. And though search parties combed the forest for days, they found nothing, except, near the split oak tree, 2 small carved dolls, lying side by side in the dirt, their wooden faces turned toward the trees. The townspeople would say, for years after, that sometimes at night you could hear tapping at the windows on the edge of the woods. Always 3 slow taps, a pause, then 2. And if you listened closely after, you might hear the faint sound of 2 girls laughing, far off among the trees. If you believe the sisters are still out there, type "they're not gone" in the comments. The night after the failed search, the town of Willow Creek felt heavier than before. Even the air seemed reluctant to move, clinging to the streets like a wet blanket. The lanterns that hung outside the sheriff's office swayed ever so slightly, though there was no wind to push them. Inside, Sheriff Abel Morris sat hunched over his desk, staring at a map of the surrounding forest. His eyes kept drifting back to one spot on the paper, a small hollow west of the creek, a place no one dared to go after sunset. It wasn't marked on most maps, and for good reason. The old folks called it the hollow that waited. Stories about the hollow were passed down in whispers, never spoken in the presence of children. They said it had no birds, no insects, no life at all. That the ground there never stayed dry, even in summer. And worst of all, that if you went too deep, the forest would rearrange itself behind you, making the way out impossible to find. Some said the trees there were not trees at all, but something older, something that remembered the faces of everyone who entered, and kept them. Abel knew these were old tales meant to scare people. Yet that night, when he closed his eyes, he saw the Sinclair sisters standing at the edge of the hollow. They were barefoot. Their dresses were soaked from the knees down. They didn't speak. They only stared, and the darkness behind them seemed thicker than the rest of the night. By morning, Abel made up his mind. He would go to the hollow, even if it meant going alone. The forest greeted him with silence. No birds, no crunch of leaves beneath his boots. Only the sound of his own breath and the faint creak of the old leather strap that held his rifle to his back. The deeper he went, the stranger the air became. It was colder now, though the sun had not yet fully risen. And then he noticed the smell, not rot, not soil, but something metallic, like rusted iron or dried blood. When he reached the hollow, he knew at once why people feared it. The trees were not like any he had seen before. Their bark was blackened, almost charred, and their branches reached out in unnatural curves, as though they were trying to touch each other. The ground was soft, almost spongy, and when Abel's boots pressed into it, water bubbled up around the edges. But it wasn't clear water, it was dark, almost ink-like, and it stained his boots as it touched them. Abel took a deep breath and stepped forward. He followed a faint trail until it disappeared entirely, swallowed by the strange, pulpy earth. Then he saw them, small footprints, side by side, leading deeper into the hollow. They were too small to be anyone but the Sinclair sisters. His heart pounded as he crouched to examine them. The prints were fresh, too fresh. As he stood up, a low sound drifted through the trees. It was like humming, but not quite. It had a strange rhythm, rising and falling in a way that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand. Abel turned toward the sound, moving slowly, afraid to make a noise. That was when he saw movement ahead. Two figures stood about 30 feet away. They were facing away from him, their heads tilted slightly as though listening to something only they could hear. Their hair was long tangled and matted with something dark. Their dresses hung heavy, wet and clinging to their legs. Abel felt his mouth go dry. "Clara? Joanna," he called softly. The figures didn't move. He took a step closer. His boots sank into the soft ground with a squelch, and the figures turned in unison. What Abel saw next would follow him for the rest of his life. Their faces were pale, their lips almost blue. Their eyes, those wide, innocent eyes, were completely black, as though the pupils had swallowed everything else. Water dripped steadily from their hair and dresses, pooling at their bare feet, yet there was no water source around them. Their mouths opened at the same time, but no sound came out. Instead, Abel heard the humming again, only now he realized it wasn't coming from them. It was coming from the trees. The black bark shivered. The branches creaked. Something in the forest itself seemed to lean closer. Abel's hand went to his rifle, but before he could lift it, the ground beneath his feet shifted, like a wave passing under the soil. He stumbled, and when he looked back up, the girls were gone. Panic clawed at his chest. He turned in circles, scanning the twisted forest. The humming grew louder, filling his skull until it felt like his own thoughts were drowning. He tried to follow the footprints again, but they stopped abruptly, vanishing into the soft earth as if the girls had been swallowed whole. Abel backed away, but the trees seemed closer now, their crooked shapes bending toward him. He thought he saw faces in the bark, hollow eyes and open mouths, all frozen in silent screams. The metallic smell was stronger. The ground gurgled beneath his boots. Something brushed the back of his neck. He spun around, rifle raised, but there was nothing, only the dark trees, watching. When Abel finally stumbled out of the hollow, hours had passed though it felt like minutes. His boots were soaked, his hands trembling. He didn't remember the walk back to town. But he knew one thing. The Sinclair sisters had been there. And something else had been with them. That night, the sheriff didn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those black eyes staring back at him. He heard the humming. And worst of all, he saw the trees waiting. In the comments, tell me what you think the humming was. Was it the forest or something hiding inside it? The rain had not stopped since the night Mary Ann Sinclair's bonnet was found snagged in the blackberry thorns. It was the sort of rain that seemed to come from the ground as well as the sky, wet mist curling through the trees, clinging to clothes, and settling cold into the bones. The little Oregon town of Clatsop Hollow had grown quiet, as though the air itself knew it was carrying a secret too heavy to speak aloud. By the third week of the search, most believed the Sinclair sisters were gone forever. The volunteers no longer trudged into the forest in large groups. Instead, only a few men went out each morning, returning by sundown with tired eyes and empty hands. The forest had grown greedy, swallowing not just the girls, but the hope of those who had cared for them. That morning, the sheriff knocked on Elias Goodwin's door. Elias was the oldest man in town, his face wrinkled like the bark of an old cedar tree, his eyes pale and cloudy. He'd lived in Clatsop Hollow since before most people could remember. "You've walked more of these woods than any of us," the sheriff said. "We need a new path to follow, somewhere we haven't looked." Elias stood in the doorway, silent, his hand gripping the wood frame as though it were the only thing holding him up. "There's a place," he said at last, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not a place you look for people. It's a place you leave things behind." The sheriff frowned. What do you mean? Elias only shook his head and stepped back into the dimness of his cabin. After a few moments, he returned carrying something wrapped in an oilskin cloth. He set it on the table and slowly unfolded it. Inside was a map, old, the edges torn, the paper yellowed and soft. The ink was faded, but there were marks and lines unlike any map the sheriff had seen. Paths that twisted strangely, circles in the middle of nowhere, and tiny symbols drawn like a language from a dream. This was given to me in 1823, Elias said, by a man who claimed he'd followed the whispers of the woods. Said the map changes, that it shows places that aren't always there. The sheriff stared at it. And you think the girls are? Elias cut him off. I think they went somewhere that most folk can't reach. Somewhere the forest only opens for those it chooses. That afternoon, the sheriff gathered a small group, himself, Elias, and 2 others, to follow the map. They left when the rain lightened, heading into the forest on a narrow trail behind the old Sinclair property. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. Even the usual drip of rain seemed to hush, as though sound itself was afraid. After an hour, the trees began to change. Their trunks grew thicker, their bark darker. Moss hung from the branches in long, wet curtains. Elias kept his eyes on the map, turning it slowly in his hands, as if the directions shifted when he moved. At one point he stopped, tilted his head, and closed his eyes. "Do you hear that?" he asked. The sheriff shook his head. But Elias smiled a strange smile. "They're talking to us." It wasn't until they crossed a shallow stream that the sheriff heard it too, faint, distant, almost like the giggle of a child carried on the wind. He froze, scanning the trees. "Marianne? Eliza," he called. The giggle stopped. Something, a shadow, maybe, moved between 2 trees. They followed quickly, but the trail led them into a grove they had never seen before. The air here was warmer, thick with the smell of damp earth and wildflowers. In the center of the grove stood a single oak, its bark pale and smooth, as if it had been stripped of color. And carved into the trunk were names. The sheriff stepped forward, his breath catching in his throat. There, among dozens of other names, were Marianne Sinclair and Eliza Sinclair. The letters were sharp, fresh, as though cut just hours ago. "How?" the sheriff began, but Elias was staring at the ground. Beneath the tree, the soil was loose, freshly disturbed. He knelt, running his fingers through it, then pulled back suddenly. His hand trembled. "What is it?" one of the men asked. Elias looked up, his pale eyes glistening in the dim light. "This ground," he said, "is not for the living." That was when the whispers began again, not faint this time, but all around them. Voices in every direction, speaking words they didn't understand, rising and falling like the wind through the leaves. The sheriff turned, his lantern swinging wildly, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. Shapes darted between the trees, too quick to see clearly. One of the men, Samuel Briggs, shouted. "Something touched me." He slapped at his arm, but there was nothing there. Still, his skin was cold where it had brushed him, so cold it burned. Elias folded the map and shoved it back into his coat. "We have to leave," he said, his voice urgent. "If we stay past sundown, we won't leave at all." The sheriff wanted answers, but the sky was already darkening, the gray clouds bleeding into black. Reluctantly, they turned back, but the path they had come on was gone. The forest seemed to have shifted. Trees stood where none had been before, and the ground sloped in unfamiliar ways. Panic set in. They pushed forward, calling out to one another, until at last they stumbled onto a familiar trail. By the time they reached the Sinclair property, the first stars were just visible through the rain. The sheriff swore never to follow the map again. But Elias? He kept it. And late at night, when the rain was heavy and the wind carried faint giggles from the trees, he would sit by his fire, unfold the map, and listen. Because somewhere out there, the forest still knew the names of the Sinclair sisters. And it was still whispering. If you had found the map, would you follow it or burn it? The nights had grown heavier in the old Sinclair house. No one lived there now, yet the windows always seemed to hold a faint glow when the moon was high, as if someone had lit candles inside. By the 4th week after the sisters vanished, Sheriff Wilkins had given up on the idea of finding them alive. The search parties had stopped going into the forest. The riverbanks had been checked 100 times. The townsfolk stopped talking about them in the streets, but only because they were too afraid that speaking their names might bring something into their own homes. Still, there were a few who could not let the matter rest. One of them was Samuel Doran, a quiet man who had been the Sinclair family's closest neighbor for 20 years. Samuel didn't believe in curses. He didn't believe in spirits, either, until the night he heard it. He had been walking past the house on his way home from the mill. The fog was so thick it seemed to bend the sound of his own footsteps. As he passed the gate, he heard it, a faint tapping from inside the floorboards. At first, he thought it was a loose shutter slamming in the wind. But then came the voices. Not full words. Not even whispers he could make sense of. Just the sound of someone breathing against wood. It was coming from beneath the house. Samuel's heart pounded, but something drew him toward the steps. He pushed open the creaking front door. Inside, the air was thick with a smell he couldn't name, damp earth, old wood, and something faintly metallic. The tapping grew louder, then stopped. "Hello," he called, his voice breaking in the stillness. Something shifted below the floorboards, a dragging sound, as though nails were scraping along the beams. He froze. The breath under his feet deepened, slow and heavy. Then came the laughter. It wasn't the light laugh of children. It was wrong, stretched too long, hollow, as if it came from a throat that had forgotten how to be human. Samuel backed out of the doorway, nearly tripping over the steps. But before he could reach the gate, the front door slammed shut on its own. The sound echoed across the field, startling the crows from the fence posts. The next morning, Samuel tried to tell the sheriff what he'd heard. But Wilkins only gave him a tired look and said, "Some things are better left under the floor, Doran. You understand?" Samuel didn't. Not then. But he would soon. That night, he dreamt of the Sinclair sisters, not as he remembered them, but pale and wide-eyed, crawling through tight, dark spaces, their fingers bloodied from clawing at the wood. In his dream, they opened their mouths to speak, but no words came. Only dirt spilled out. When Samuel awoke, his boots were on. His feet were muddy, and there was a faint tapping coming from under his bed. If you heard tapping beneath your floor at night, would you dare to lift the boards and look, or would you try to pretend it wasn't there? Tell me in the comments. The fire had been out for 3 days, yet the smell of burned wood still clung to the air like a memory that refused to fade. The old Sinclair home was nothing more than a hollowed skeleton now, charred beams sticking out of the ground like broken ribs, a blackened fireplace standing alone, stubborn and defiant. People in town crossed the road when they passed it, as if even the ashes could reach out and grab them. Elijah Porter had been one of the first to see the blaze. He hadn't told anyone what he saw just before the fire truly took hold. Not the sheriff, not even his own wife. But tonight, with the shadows thick and the wind rattling through the empty shell of the house, he found himself muttering it aloud under his breath. There was someone inside, he whispered to no one. The night before, Elijah had been walking home from the mill when he'd spotted movement in the upstairs window of the Sinclair house. He remembered thinking it strange. No one lived there anymore. The sisters were gone. Their parents were gone. And yet, a pale figure had stood at the window, watching him. He had frozen in place, the street silent except for his own breathing. He swore the figure moved, slowly, unnaturally, its head tilting as though listening to something far away. Then, in a sudden flash, a light burst behind it, and smoke began to curl upward. Elijah had run for help, but by the time he returned, the flames had swallowed the house whole. Now, staring into the blackened remains, He felt as though something was still watching from the darkness. The sheriff, Charles Grady, was less than pleased to find Elijah wandering near the ruins that night. "You ought to keep your distance," Grady said, voice low. "Folks say strange things been happening here since the fire." "What kind of strange?" Elijah asked, his voice unsteady. Grady's eyes flicked to the empty windows. "Voices," he muttered. "Singing mostly. Sometimes crying. But never in a way that sounds alive." Elijah felt a cold weight settle in his chest. He'd heard something too, faint, almost swallowed by the wind. A woman's voice humming a slow tune. He thought it might have been the same lullaby his grandmother used to sing. But here, in this place, it was wrong. Off. Too slow, like the singer's mouth was trying to remember how the words went but couldn't quite find them. The two men stood in silence for a long moment, the wind pushing through the ruins. Then they both heard it. A soft creak, like a footstep on an old wooden floor. Grady stepped forward, hand on his revolver. Elijah stayed back, but he couldn't look away. There was no floor left in the house, just the scorched dirt and broken timbers. But the sound came again, deliberate and slow, moving from where the front door had been toward the stairs that no longer existed. Then, clear as anything, a voice, soft, female, spoke from the darkness. "Go back." Elijah stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a fallen beam. Grady froze, his breath visible in the cold air. The voice had come from the very center of the ruins, and yet it carried with it a strange stillness, as though the night itself had stopped to listen. Grady called out, "Who's there?" No answer. Only that low hum again, drifting in and out, growing quieter until it faded into nothing. Elijah wanted to leave, but his feet wouldn't move. His eyes were fixed on the remains of the fireplace. In the glow of the moon, he saw something. Marks scratched deep into the soot-covered bricks. He didn't notice them earlier, but now they seemed fresh, as if made after the fire. 3 symbols, side by side. The first was a circle with a line through it. The second looked like 2 interlocking triangles. The third was just a handprint. Small, delicate, like a child's. Elijah swallowed hard. "Sheriff," he whispered, "I think the girls are still here." The sheriff didn't answer right away. His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on the marks. "Not here," he finally said. "Not in the way you mean." They left quickly after that, neither daring to look back. But Elijah didn't sleep that night. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing that voice in his head. Go back. Not leave. Not run. Not stay away. Go back. And he knew deep down that if he didn't return to the ruins again, he'd never sleep soundly for the rest of his life. Share your theory. Who, or what, set the Sinclair house on fire? The forest had been silent for hours. Too silent. Even the wind had stopped, as though the very air was holding its breath. Sheriff James Whitlock stood at the edge of the clearing where the Sinclair cabin once stood. The ruins had long since been claimed by moss and rotting wood, but something about the night felt wrong. Heavier. Colder. Behind him, lanterns swayed in the hands of the search party, their dim light flickering like tired stars. They had come to finish it tonight. At least, that was the plan. The strange tracks found near the river 2 days ago had led them back here, where everything began. They were not animal tracks. The shapes were twisted, too long, and they went in circles, as though whatever made them enjoyed confusing anyone who followed. James had studied them under the dim moonlight and counted 6 distinct sets. There were only supposed to be 2 sisters. They stepped deeper into the woods, their boots sinking into damp earth. The men didn't speak. It wasn't fear keeping them quiet. It was the feeling that the moment they opened their mouths, something listening in the dark would hear them. At the front of the group, Henry March, a trapper who had lived near these woods for 20 years, stopped suddenly. His shoulders stiffened. James caught up to him and whispered, "What is it?" Henry didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on the path ahead. The trail had changed. Instead of mud and leaves, the ground looked smooth, almost like frozen glass. The lantern light reflected faintly on it, as if ice had formed in the middle of a warm September night. "Don't step on it," Henry breathed. "Not unless you want to see them." James frowned. "See who?" Henry only shook his head and stepped back, letting James lead. The sheriff's heart pounded as he placed his boot down on the cold surface. The sound it made wasn't a crunch or a snap. It was a hollow echo, like stepping into an empty room. The world shifted. The woods were gone. The men were gone. James stood alone in the middle of a narrow dirt road, the smell of rain in the air. In the distance, two girls in white dresses stood side by side, their hair loose and tangled, their hands clasped together. "Mary." "Eliza," he called, his voice trembling. They turned their heads at the same time, in perfect unison. Their faces were pale, almost gray, and their eyes were not right. Too dark, too deep, like looking into the bottom of a well. "You shouldn't be here, Sheriff," one of them said. He couldn't tell which. The other smiled faintly. "It's our turn now." James took a step forward, but the ground beneath him cracked, and he was falling into blackness, hearing laughter that was not the laughter of children. It was older, sharper, and full of hunger. When he opened his eyes, he was lying in the clearing again. Lantern light burned his eyes, and the search party stood over him, pale with fear. "You were gone for hours," Henry said, voice shaking. "We thought you'd vanished too." James sat up. His hands were covered in frost. His breath came out in white clouds, though the night was warm. And then he noticed, on the ground, where he had fallen, were two small handprints pressed into the frozen soil. No one spoke as they left the forest. No one looked back. Years later, when people asked James about the Sinclair sisters, he never told them about the cold road or the strange girls waiting at the end. He never told them what they said. But sometimes, on nights when the wind stopped and the woods went silent, he swore he could hear 6 sets of footsteps outside his door. And when the knocking started, he did not open it. If it were you, and you saw the two sisters standing in the middle of a deserted road, would you walk toward them, or run? And more importantly, what do you think was following them all along? And that is where our journey through the haunting disappearance of the Sinclair sisters ends. Or perhaps it doesn't. Because in places like these, stories never truly die. They just wait, quietly, in the shadows for someone new to hear them. If you've stayed with me until now, I want to thank you. You've walked through the cold streets of 1855 Oregon with me. You've stood in that silence, and maybe, just maybe, you felt the same strange shiver that still lingers in this town. But remember, history is holes. And sometimes, what falls into them isn't supposed to come back. Now I have something to ask you. If you've heard of similar disappearances in your own country, share them in the comments below. And also, tell me, which country are you watching from? I love seeing where my viewers are from. If you enjoyed this story and want to uncover more cases like this, mysterious, terrifying, and hidden deep in history, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. Until then, sleep well. And if you can, try not to dream of the Sinclair sisters.